It was a fall morning in 1873. 4 Modoc warriors looked out from the gallows at Fort Klamath. The view barely resembled the world they'd known before the white invaders arrived. Black Jim and Boston Charlie had led the Modoc in battle. Captain Jack killed an army general. Swanson John shot a preacher. Their hanging marked the final removal of the Modoc from their ancestral land. It hadn't been easy. Three times, the American government tried to move the Modoc onto the Klamath Reservation, though resident natives made them unwelcome. But in 1872, nearly half the Modoc returned to their homeland, determined never to leave again. In the end, it took nearly 1,000 troops and militia to rout 55 Modoc fighters and their women, children, and elderly from the lava beds south of Tule Lake. Miles of sharp basalt hills with caves and hidden passageways where they would be protected, their shamans said, by dances, songs, and a long rope of Tule reeds dyed red and strung round their stronghold. And for 5 months, it worked. The soldiers suffered heavy casualties until their howitzers forced the Modoc to retreat. And finally, after betrayal by fellow tribesmen, the last remaining band surrendered. The war captured headlines from San Francisco to London, and the execution drew more than 800 spectators, including the surviving Modoc forced to attend. The severed heads of the condemned men were sent to the Army Museum in Washington, D.C. We've all got a destiny to fulfill, dictated by the conditions we're born into. As a child, the Modoc chief known as Captain Jack had witnessed the murder of his parents and fellow villagers by white miners. But he didn't want a war that would seal the doom of his people. Conditions simply left him no alternative. But the same conditions offered his cousin, Winema, a different option. The chance to walk in both worlds, partner of the newcomers and defender of her people. A mediator and interpreter, she saved Modoc and white alike. Winema means woman chief, and she'd earned the name as a teenage warrior leading raids against neighboring tribes. But Winema had always been different, and she was destined to promote peace. Born with a reddish tint to her hair and called strange child at birth, young Winema was fascinated by an injured white man recovering at her village. His tales of trains and cities made her want to learn more, and so, while in a trading party with her father near Wairika, she met a gold miner named Frank Riddle. Winema's cousin had already taken up with a white man. He invited Frank to visit, and there Winema was waiting, dressed in Modoc finery and singing love songs. And why not? Her traditional life was vanishing. Soon the invaders would outnumber her people, so she married Frank, learned English, and was known as Toby Riddle. But she and Frank lived with the Modoc and raised their son in both worlds. And soon she was called to bring them together. In 1863, a decade before the final battle, she served as mediator between warring tribes and whites in Wairika. 2 years later, Captain Jack and other Modoc leaders were gathered with whites, led by Methodist preacher Alfred Meacham, for another peace conference. And just as an agreement appeared within reach, the Modoc drew their weapons. The whites responded in kind. Between them stepped Winema, whose pleas averted bloodshed again. It wouldn't be the last time, but in the end, she couldn't prevent the inevitable. And neither could Alfred Meacham. A white preacher, he'd grown up among freed slaves in the Midwest. His sympathies were with the natives. But those sympathies were tested when he rode into Oregon as superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1869. Meacham had known both the warmth and devotion of the Indian, he said, and the pain of his treachery, the sting of his arrows. He'd also seen the crimes committed by men of his race, because when the exterminators went riding for native scalps, no one could remain unaware. They'd start by parading down Main Street, waving their flag and singing. Such a crowd of drunken miners had entered a Modoc camp under a white flag some years earlier. Without warning, they killed more than 40 men, women, and children, took the scalps to Wairika, and celebrated for a week. Among the dead, the family of Captain Jack. Such men sometimes held native Wyndham in bondage, and Winema campaigned to gain the legal status of wife for her sisters. Meacham joined her and threatened the men with legal action if they didn't comply. And thus was established the friendship that would save the preacher's life on a winter day in 1873, when Winema joined him and other white and Modoc leaders in a last-ditch effort to end the standoff in the lava beds. A mile away, troops waited. Modoc warriors lay in the rocks nearby. On the hillside, Winema's 10-year-old son watched through a telescope. No shots had yet been fired. Earlier, Winema and Frank had tried to warn General Canby not to meet the Modoc, who meant to kill him. She'd heard Captain Jack's young warriors. Killing the leader would cause the soldiers to retreat, they maintained, and they mocked Captain Jack as a coward. Alas, the Modoc Way required a chief to follow the will of his people, and so he gave in. The lava beds will be our homeland, Captain Jack vowed. If they don't agree, I will kill them myself. And he did, drawing his pistol and firing directly into General Canby's face. Winema grabbed Swanson John's weapon, but not before he had shot Meacham 3 times and begun to scalp him. Still, her warning that soldiers were coming scared him off, and with her help, Meacham survived. In 1874, shortly after the hanging, Meacham traveled to Oklahoma, where the Modoc prisoners and other tribal members had been relocated. He found a group of Modoc men playing croquet, including 2 members of the party who had nearly killed him, the same 2 who later betrayed Captain Jack in exchange for immunity. Meacham came not for revenge, however, but to recruit a few Modoc to join him, Winema, Frank, and their son in his stage play about the war. And together, they toured the East with their tale of heroic resistance, treachery, and friendship in the Wild West, starring the woman chief Meacham dubbed Pocahontas of the lava beds.